Hello and welcome to this week's ICA in Conversation. Of course, broadcast twice a month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter financial crime. Now available on Apple, Spotify, and of course on the ICA website, as well as here on LinkedIn. My name's Tim Tyler, and coming up, we're going to consider the urgent and the challenging issue of fraud, its scale, its nature, how it's evolving, and how we can respond effectively to it. I'm joined for this discussion by Matthew Field. Matthew is the head of the UK Fraud Advisory Panel, and like me, he's spent much of his career working in the context of counter fraud. So Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very grateful for your time, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Before we make a start though, can I thank all those that have joined us around the world? I hope this is a useful discussion, and I hope also that you can contribute to our thinking. So as normal, we're going to speak for about 20 minutes. And that will leave some time towards the end, maybe about 10 minutes in total, to pick up on any questions that you may ask. You can ask those questions by typing them into the comments section for this event on LinkedIn. And I'll be monitoring those comments in real time. And of course, we'll use them as a basis for the last 10 minutes. If there aren't any questions, well, that's all right. Very interested to hear your views, even if they aren't in the context of a question. And I do hope that you can join the discussion in that way. So that's set the scene, I hope. Thank you again for joining me, Matthew. I mentioned the Fraud Advisory Panel in the introduction. Perhaps it would be useful just to hear a few words about what that is, because of course you head it, you lead it for the UK. It plays an important part within the anti-fraud forest. But what does that look like?
Hi, Tim. Yeah, great to speak to you, and obviously great to discuss this today. So the Fraud Advisory Panel, we are an independent charity based in the UK. We work very closely with a number of organisations cross-sector. We have a board of trustees, again, from various sectors, accountancy, law. But the key for us is that we are an independent charity. So our activity is really driven towards how can we stop fraud? How can we support businesses? How can we support those that need that support to really tackle fraud, to address it, and to really look at what that kind of looks like for businesses of all sizes and all sectors. We have been going for about 26 years now. We were set up by the ICA. And now, as I say, we have a number of corporate members from across sector and individuals as well. We've run various campaigns over the years. We now look at working very closely with charities. We've been running Charity Fraud Awareness Week for 10 years. So really supporting that sector, those that need that help, because they help others. So how can we support the charity sector and make sure the money goes to the right place? We also work with businesses, and we've done a lot of work recently with universities and different people to get that message out there of what a counter-fraud career can look like. And also, what can you do today and in the future to protect yourselves, your businesses, your future roles, really, by using the expertise that we have in the field at the moment.
Fantastic. Matthew, thank you. And I'd like to come back to some of the things that you've talked about, particularly your work with universities. That sounds fascinating, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes' time. The role that you have is, of course, pivotal in the context of quite a busy forest of different counter-fraud organisations like the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency, the Home Office, police forces, and so on. But you mentioned that you were set up by the ICAEW. We ought to just clarify, that's one of the regulators for the accountancy, arguably the leading regulator for the accountancy profession here in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. So they set us up and they continue to support us. But the reason I always say about having that independence is it's a real strength of ours that we can sit there as a charity. We're not working for profit. We're not working for financial reasons to an extent. We are just working to try and help as many people as we can. And that's where we have our corporate membership, our individual membership, who all join us, give us their expertise, really collaborate, educate, and work together.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things that we spoke about when we were preparing for this conversation was the scale of fraud at a global level. And I know that you're a little bit cautious about putting too many numbers to this because, of course, by its very nature, it is hidden. It is beneath the radar. And so trying to estimate the sheer scale of this can be a problem. But there are reports that suggest that it is in the trillions of dollars. It's perhaps best measured by referencing the value of fraud in terms of the percentage of global GDP, gross domestic product. What are your thoughts here? And is this increasing at the moment?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned obviously the figures. The reason the way I look at stats and figures around fraud is it's very easy to get almost overwhelmed by those numbers. Whereas if we accept that it is a problem across society and across sectors that is continuing to grow, it almost makes it more manageable, in my opinion, because if we like the numbers that are applied to fraud, as you say, in the trillions, they're so big, you almost look at it and think, well, where can you start to really address a problem of that size? So for us, we look at it and say, we know that it is an issue that is embedded. It's not something that is going to just go away. Therefore, how can we manage it? What can we do to actually address it? As opposed to saying it is this figure, accepting that it continues to evolve. If we look at fraud in general, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, never mind 20 to 25 years ago, it's changed. And we know that in the next 12 months, 5 years, it will continue to change. And it's the fact that it's so underreported that whatever figure is put on it, it's open to challenge. If we just accept that it is a huge problem that we all need to address, because one fraud to an organization, it's irrelevant what that scale is. It's one fraud that could really finish a company, not to mention individuals. So I think the theme of it continues to evolve. Let's look at the awareness of fraud as a general problem is the best way to approach it, really.
Okay, thank you. So just picking up on that, how is it evolving? What are we seeing at the moment that perhaps wasn't as prevalent just a few years ago? And I think the other part to this question is, well, how is it the same?
Yeah, so we've done work over recent years. We have a charity fraud survey that I've mentioned, and that gives us really good insight into what the charity sector are experiencing. But one thing that comes from it is there is the new or the newer frauds, the tech-enabled frauds, those things that we hear, the voice cloning, the CEO fraud, the AI threat. Those are the areas, obviously, where there has been the biggest development over recent years. I wouldn't go as far as to say they're new, but they're new when compared to other frauds. But it is still the traditional ones that are there. Say traditional, I mean those things that are not necessarily internet tech enabled, those insider issues, those policies that you've got in place internally. So those that are committed more in person without the use of tech. But certainly those things like voice cloning and that big AI banner are where we've seen the biggest change. But also my approach to that is we at least know what we are facing now. We know that that is going to continue to evolve. And instead of looking at it as saying that is a threat that we can't understand, we can probably, as a counter-fraud community, working together, understand it more than we actually realize. It's not as if these enablers have arrived overnight. They've been growing over time. We have the tools as an industry to actually work against it. We know what we are facing, and as they continue to evolve, so our response can.
So there is a sort of commonality that we're seeing. Fraud at its heart involves a victim, typically being targeted, making a decision, very often unaware of the implications of that decision, based on a lie, based on some kind of deception, and some kind of exchange, transaction, typically flowing from that, or, of course, transaction being withheld as a result of that. And that, at its heart, doesn't change. What we're seeing, of course, is that there are new ways that criminals are using to persuade people, to put them in a position which makes them vulnerable to this kind of activity. And artificial intelligence, of course, is one of many different drivers to underpin this. But it is ultimately human behavior, and on occasions it's human greed that drives this. Fair comment?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to say that no matter what the enabler is, what happens is still the same. Those areas that the criminals look to exploit remain the same. The urgency, the vulnerability. There's a line that we use in a lot of the presentations, because this was looking specifically at charity fraud, and it's around the exploitation of goodwill. So it's looking at the criminals will look at where is that vulnerability. They will then just use a different enabler to action this particular fraud, that particular type of crime. But as you say, it's still human to human to an extent.
Ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
But of course, it becomes more interesting, more challenging, because of some of the new techniques that are being involved, that you've touched upon along the way. So fraud as a threat then is evolving, and it's evolving quite rapidly. There is some commonality, but we're seeing new areas, new challenges. What are you doing then in response to this? So, I mean, you mentioned the work of the Fraud Advisory Panel, and of course, it's not isolated, it's working with many others. What kind of activity is taking place to have an impact on this?
As you say, we're one of many organisations that are set up to tackle fraud, not to mention organisations that have their own internal teams. But our main focus is really on adding detail and context to the words that we always hear: education, collaboration. Well, what does that mean? And we have really pushed over the last few years to use the expertise of different people, different organizations, and bring them together to speak, to say, because fraud and economic crime is one of the only things really that links all businesses. It's irrelevant what organization you are, what sector you operate in. Fraudsters don't care. If they go to one sector, they will then go to another. So we can then, as a counter fraud community, all come together to actually share information, to work together. So what have we been doing over recent times? I mentioned Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and that's a really strong campaign of ours, because we have the charity sector. This is now, it was its 9th year last year. This obviously be its 10th. Charities working together as a sector to discuss, this is what we are experiencing, this is how we are countering it. But then the private sector and the public also sharing their practices, sharing their information. How can you identify a fraud? How can you mitigate it? How can you address it? If you do experience a fraud, what are your options? All those things, all those tools that are out there that other organizations, that other people have to offer each other. We've been really pushing that message, and it is about speaking to each other, having those honest and open conversations through our campaigns, through our different forums. We, as I mentioned, our corporate membership, our individual membership, bringing them together. They now produce material for us for charity, as I say, Charity Fraud Awareness Week, but also other businesses. What does a response plan look like? What does what does your initial response look like? All of those are stored on our website. And then in April of last year, we launched our Future Counter Fraud community, because we recognise that the fact that we are having this conversation, that so many people have joined us, it is a really passionate community. People want to do the right thing. People work in this sector to make a difference and to stop economic crime. And there is a huge amount of experience. So when you have that experience and that enthusiasm, it's a great opportunity now to say, we know that economic crime and fraud is embedded. So let's work with those that are going to be taking forward this work in the next 5 years, 10 years. So we launched the Future Counter Fraud community, going out to universities, really to deliver guest lectures and say, this is what a career looks like. This is what, in practice, through the professionals that are facing this every day, this is what we are experiencing, to really bring those studies to life, to give them an idea of what their career will look like in the short term and the medium term. And we've also introduced a mentoring scheme, which has grown very, very quickly, which again evidences just how engaged people are. We launched the community in April, and we said we would like to create something where we have students, people looking to change careers at any point, or they might look to develop their careers, move in a different path. How can we support them? How can we help them be better counter fraud professionals, now and further down the line? And we had people register as mentors, and that's grown really, really quickly. We're coming to the end of our first year now. So as a small charity, we can't take on the amount of people that we have wanted to, which again shows how passionate the community is. So it's addressing the frauds today, the businesses, the charities, through that expertise we have, but it's really looking further down the track with that FCFC. That was the driver to develop that community.
Sorry, the FCFC.
The FCFC, yeah, the Future Counter Fraud Community. That's the title that we gave it. We looked at lots of different titles for it, and we said the Future Counter Fraud Community because really, what are we looking to do? Well, it's further down the line, and we want to create that idea that it isn't sector specific. It isn't, where are you in your career? Are you 20 years down the line? Have you not even started your career? You're still part of the same campaign. So that's how we came up with that title.
That's helpful. I can remember when I first joined the police in 1984, a lecture very much along the lines that you've just described from someone working in the fraud community. And it sparked my interest. And that acted as a catalyst for a career that has been heavily involved in a wide variety of financial crime. So yes, I can relate to that very, very well. Thank you. So what you're describing is the real appetite within industry and arguably law enforcement regulators to work together to counter this threat, to raise awareness, to raise skills. And that, I think, is a really important point about whether we've got the right skill set in order to counter it in this space. Can I pick up on some of the questions that have been asked? And I'm very grateful to those that have done that. There is a common theme to many of the questions, and my thanks to Tamina, to Amir, and to Michael in particular, all of whom have asked about the impact of artificial intelligence. I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that, because there are some really quite sobering accounts of how AI has enabled a variety of different new types of fraud. And you mentioned voice cloning. We know that one particular large business in Hong Kong, I think, transferred a very large amount of money, I think it was in the millions, as a result of someone talking to a deep fake, who they thought was the CEO, telling them, and it wasn't just audio, it was video as well, telling them to make that transfer. So this sort of thing is happening. We're seeing quite sophisticated AI-driven romance scams. So it's now on another level where AI is gathering information around potential targets, harvesting that from across the internet, social media platforms and the like, and then is targeting those individuals with very individual and personal information. which makes them more vulnerable, and it will also make them think that this contact that they're receiving is from a genuine person. So there's a variety of things that we're seeing here. I think the question is, well, what's the appropriate response? And one of the things that you've said already is that we need to keep focused on the core. We need to make sure that we're not so carried away with this that we lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, it's about human beings being deceived ultimately by other human beings, albeit with AI acting as an interface. So that's one thing that you said. Would you go any further in terms of thinking about our response to this?
Yeah, I would. I think one of the points that I would really pick up on with the types of fraud that you've mentioned, the CEO fraud, the AI around, romance scams, it's a case of the urgency that they place, the way that they drive people to carry out actions. It's that urgency and that emotion that they play on. And I think the fact that we are recognizing that now, we know, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to continue to evolve. So in a business, for example, how are you communicating with your staff around, if we look just specifically on that CEO fraud example that you mentioned, how are you communicating with staff? What is in place to kind of ensure that or to best protect yourself that doesn't happen? Are there various lines that you have? Do you change comms on a weekly basis? How do you really engage and support your staff to know that this is a threat? And it's also, like most frauds, or all frauds really, it's having that honest conversation, accepting that it is there and you could potentially be a target. And once you accept that, then we can address it. And on an individual basis, it is a case of, it's very difficult to say because they're all so individual. But if we just look at these people prey on the vulnerabilities of businesses, of society, they will push for urgency, they will create emotion. And as long as we can all work together to get that message out that this is what the criminals are doing, this is what they are going to look for, then that's a huge step forward.
So raising awareness then,
yeah, I think
becomes
absolutely, yeah,
vital to the success in this. And having that awareness within ourselves that this individual that we think we're talking to, it's shocking, but it could actually be a machine. This email that we're receiving that seems to come from the CEO, because that's what the credentials seem to say, actually could be from some hostile actor. So if I understand you correctly, that awareness is fundamental, and it's a key element to what you're doing within the Fraud Advisory Panel, raising awareness. But also, alongside that, you've talked about the importance of having a toolkit, having the right policies in place. Some of that is about procurement, of course, recognizing the potential for not only external, but internal fraud as a threat. So, and again, I think you touched on this earlier on in the discussion, there's a danger that we're so dazzled by artificial intelligence that we take our eye off some of the other more sustained challenges, one of which, of course, is internal fraud. It's a very good example. The highest vulnerability that we have, I don't know if you would agree with this, but certainly in my mind, our highest, generally speaking, within business, our highest vulnerability is from within the business and from our own staff at every level of the organization. And so there's a danger that we become so focused on AI that we lose sight of, well, actually there's something closer to home, more realistic and more present than that. Is that fair?
Yeah, correct. And I think if we look at the fact that those internal, the risks there, it's also an opportunity, as I try to, whenever I discuss fraud and this kind of topic, it's important, I think, to try and look at things, how can it be a positive? And absolutely, the insider threat is a problem, but also our staff are our greatest line of defense. So we have to have things like good. I was at a conference yesterday where whistleblowing policies were mentioned, and in two extremes. So one organization that has a lot of whistleblowing reports, one that has a low number. Well, where's the success? You would suggest that an organization that has a policy that can promote and encourage people to report, that is the successful one, because you need your staff to be comfortable. You need your staff to recognize where there are issues internally, and also training, getting that message across that you are the people who are, you are aligned into the business, your emails, your activity. So what can you do to help them? What can you do to empower them to protect your business and your organization? So it's recognizing those internal issues and those, as I said, those traditional threats, but also empowering your staff as well by recognizing there's a problem and giving them that confidence to raise concerns and also to address things that come in. What are the response plan that I always talk about at other conferences? How do they report? If there is a phishing email, they suspect, is it clear what they do with that? Not just what it looks like, but what do they do with that? Where does it go? So those next steps are really important to recognizing and mitigating.
I mean, that's really helpful. And if we can break that down a little, it's useful, I think, when we're talking about communication, to look at the three dimensions to this. And typically we think of the message, the channel, and the audience. And so you've talked about using a variety of different channels, ways to communicate. We need to be innovative, creative, need to think very carefully about how we can engage people best in a proportionate way. There are many other pressures that individuals have. It's not just the pressure of fraud. So how do we find a way that's proportionate and weaves into other messaging that the business will need to share? In terms of the audience, well, we need to recognize individuals and their particular circumstances and pressures. Some will be victims of fraud. Some might be the fraudsters themselves, and there's an opportunity to actually dissuade them and send them a message of, this is a hard place to attack. Go, try again, or go elsewhere. Not try again, go elsewhere. Think harder. And then, of course, we think of it in terms of the message. So we touched on that a moment ago, but having that clarity is really important. And you gave the example of, what do you do if you receive a phishing email? What do you do with it? So it's that level of detail sometimes that we need to go to. But equally, the message needs to have a consistency, and it needs to resonate with people and their own experience. So perhaps picking up on what's going on in the news, using that as an opportunity to highlight a particular concern, and so on. So yeah, thank you. I hope I'm just sort of summarizing some of the areas that you've touched upon. Incredibly, we've actually now come up to time. We've been talking for 30 minutes, and I'm very grateful to those that have asked questions, and I've been able to weave, I hope, the key questions, or many of the key questions, into the discussion that we've had. Can I summarize it very briefly? And I'll ask for any final thoughts from yourself, Matthew. But just very briefly, we've recognized that fraud is a very significant global and growing problem. There might be some difficulty putting numbers to it, but it is, I think, in your words, overwhelming. And of course, part of the problem that creates is, well, where do you start in countering it? We've talked about how rapidly it's evolving, and we've looked at some examples of that, including the use of artificial intelligence as a really good current driver that's very much in our minds. But in doing that, we've recognized also that we need to be careful not to be so dazzled by this new threat, the evolving threat, that we lose sight of what is perhaps more immediate, more pressing and urgent. And that would be, for instance, the potential for insider fraud and other more traditional forms of fraud that have been around for years. We've touched on the importance of communication, and that's been one of the themes, I think, from the discussion that we've had, where we've recognized that we need to act as a community, we need to act across business, and between businesses in order to share understanding, share information, raise awareness, and also generate not anxiety, but generate a willingness to challenge what's going on, to challenge what we're being told, to think about what we're being asked to do. In this context, we've thought about not only communication, but systems, toolkit, policies, procurement arrangements, and similar provisions that we're used to talking about in the context of business activity. So we've covered quite a lot of ground over the last 30 minutes. As we draw this to a close, Matthew, any final thoughts from yourself?
Great summary to bring everything together. To cover this in 30 minutes is quite a task. The main theme for me, or the main point for me, would be accepting that fraud is out there, but being proactive, getting on the front foot, prepare and be proactive as opposed to reactive when it comes to it, both as an individual and as a business. What can you control now to protect yourself, your company, further down the line?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. On that note, can I thank you again, Matthew, for joining me today, and for wherever you are joining us around the world, or whether you're listening to this as a recording on our website or on Apple or Spotify, thank you for your interest. I hope this has been of use. The next In Conversation, which takes place in 2 weeks' time, will be with Valerie Nielsen, who is a senior compliance professional from the United States. She's been very active in promoting good governance. And this will be the first of 3 webinars where we focus on compliance as an enabler. So we're trying to change the way we think and talk about compliance, recognizing that it can drive not just business activity that is compliant, but actually it can drive to good business outcomes, even to profitability. I hope you can join us for that conversation, but in the meantime, thank you again, Matthew, and do take care, everyone.